In a peaceful suburban park, where children's laughter mingled with the rustling leaves, an undercurrent of tension simmered unnoticed. A black janitor, weathered by years of humiliation, and a white man whose anger spoke louder than his conscience, clashed in a moment of searing injustice. But everything shifted when that man's 5-year-old son slipped beneath the water's surface, and the janitor, the very man he scorned, plunged into action. What happened next will shock even the most seasoned. But let's start from the beginning. In the heart of a bustling suburban neighborhood, where neatly trimmed lawns and pristine sidewalks painted a picture of serene perfection, a tension brewed beneath the surface. On a sunny afternoon, the idyllic scene was interrupted by the sharp slam of a front door. Mr. Stanley, a middle-aged resident with a reputation for his quick temper, stormed out of his red-bricked home, his face flushed with irritation. He was a man of stature, always dressed in pressed khakis and a polo shirt, his expression permanently edged with dissatisfaction. Stanley's target this time was an overflowing trash can near the curb outside his property. Bags of garbage spilled onto the sidewalk, a glaring eyesore against the backdrop of the neighborhood's tidy aesthetics. His sharp gaze scanned the area until it landed on Henry, the black janitor who was diligently scrubbing graffiti off a park bench just across the street. Henry's posture was calm, his movements steady and unhurried, as though he carried the weight of the world with practiced resilience. "Hey!" Stanley barked, his voice cutting through the hum of lawnmowers and the chirping of birds. Henry looked up, startled, but quickly masked his surprise with a polite, composed expression. Stanley marched toward him, his finger jabbing the air like a weapon. "You people can't even handle a simple job right," he bellowed, his voice dripping with frustration. He gestured wildly toward the spilled trash, the veins in his neck bulging. "What am I paying taxes for if I have to deal with this filth outside my house?" Henry, whose worn blue uniform bore testament to years of hard labor, paused his cleaning and faced Stanley. His face remained neutral, betraying none of the weariness or indignation he felt. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, sir," he replied evenly, his tone respectful but firm. "The truck scheduled to collect the trash broke down earlier today. We've been working to clear the delays as fast as we can." The explanation, calm and reasonable, seemed only to enrage Stanley further. "Excuses!" he spat, his words carrying across the street. "This is why the neighborhood is going downhill. People like you can't take any responsibility." His voice grew louder, drawing the attention of passers-by. A young woman walking her dog slowed her pace, her brows furrowing at the commotion. An elderly couple sitting on their porch exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing. Henry felt the heat of humiliation rise to his face, but he held his ground. Years of similar confrontations had taught him to remain composed, no matter how cutting the words or harsh the accusations. He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement, before turning back to his work, his hands steady as he resumed scrubbing the bench. Stanley stood there for a moment, his chest heaving, before shaking his head and retreating, muttering under his breath. As the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, Henry finished his tasks for the day. His shoulders sagged under the weight of exhaustion and the emotional toll of the encounter. He walked home in silence, his footsteps slow and deliberate. At his modest house on the edge of the neighborhood, Henry was greeted by his 2 young sons. Their wide, curious eyes watched him as he stepped through the door, placing his work bag by the wall with a quiet sigh. They didn't ask what had happened. They didn't need to. The unspoken understanding between them was born of experience. This wasn't the first time their father had endured such treatment, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Henry ruffled the hair of his youngest son before settling into his chair by the window. He gazed out at the street, his thoughts heavy. For all the progress the world claimed to have made, moments like today reminded him of the walls that still stood. But as he listened to the soft hum of his children's chatter, he resolved, as always, to keep moving forward. For their sake, he would endure. The following weekend, the park buzzed with life. Families sprawled out on checkered blankets under the shade of towering oaks, the aroma of grilled burgers and hot dogs wafting through the air. Children darted between games of tag and frisbee, their delighted squeals echoing against the cheerful backdrop of birdsong and rustling leaves. The scene was idyllic, a picture of community and carefree joy. Among the sea of picnic-goers was Timmy Stanley, a bright-eyed, curious 5-year-old with an insatiable sense of adventure. Dressed in a green t-shirt and shorts, Timmy skipped away from his family's picnic blanket, unnoticed as his parents chatted with friends. His gaze locked on the shimmering pond at the edge of the park, its surface glittering under the sun. Drawn to its sparkle, he wandered closer, his small feet crunching over the gravel path. The pond was ringed with cattles and dotted with lily pads, a serene feature of the park that masked its hidden dangers. Oblivious to the whispers of caution from nearby adults, Timmy crouched at the water's edge, fascinated by the rippling surface. A dragonfly flitted past, and in his eagerness to follow its flight, his foot slipped. With a startled cry, Timmy plunged into the water, the splash barely loud enough to catch anyone's attention at first. It wasn't until Mrs. Stanley turned and saw the ripples in the pond that the alarm was raised. "Timmy!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the laughter and chatter of the park. Her finger pointed frantically at the water, where her son's small hands broke the surface, flailing desperately before slipping under again. The realization spread like wildfire through the crowd. Gasps and exclamations rippled outward as parents instinctively pulled their own children back from the water's edge. Mr. Stanley stood frozen, his face ashen, his mind struggling to process what was happening. His feet felt like lead, his body immobilized by fear and panic. His wife's cries barely registered as his eyes stayed glued to the pond, where his youngest son was slipping further into danger. Amid the chaos, Henry was at the opposite end of the park, sweeping up litter from a picnic table. The cries reached his ears, and his head snapped toward the commotion. Spotting the small figure floundering in the pond, he immediately dropped his tools, his instincts kicking in. Without a second thought, he sprinted toward the water, his legs pumping with urgency. As he reached the pond's edge, Henry kicked off his heavy boots and dove in, the cool water enveloping him as he cut through it with practiced, confident strokes. His muscles strained as he powered toward the spot where Timmy had gone under. The murky water made it difficult to see, but Henry's years of swimming as a boy in the countryside guided him. His hand finally closed around a small, limp arm. Breaking the surface with Timmy held securely against his chest, Henry turned toward the shore. The boy coughed weakly, his small body heaving as he expelled the water he'd swallowed. Cheers and applause erupted from the crowd, but Henry focused solely on getting Timmy safely to land. Parents and onlookers rushed to meet him as he waded out of the pond, water streaming from his clothes. Mrs. Stanley was the first to reach him. She fell to her knees, her arms outstretched, as Henry gently transferred her son into her embrace. "Timmy! Oh, my baby!" she sobbed, cradling the coughing boy against her chest. Her tears wet his damp hair as she kissed his forehead repeatedly, overcome with relief and gratitude. Henry, breathing heavily but steady, stood back, allowing the family their moment. His clothes clung to his frame, drenched, but his expression was calm, his eyes scanning Timmy to ensure the boy was safe. The crowd gathered around them, their murmurs of admiration growing louder. Someone started clapping, and soon the entire park erupted in applause for Henry's heroism. Mr. Stanley, still pale, stepped forward hesitantly. His eyes, wide with a mixture of gratitude and guilt, met Henry's. But the words he wanted to say stuck in his throat, his mind reeling with the memory of their last encounter. Henry, however, gave him a brief nod before turning to collect his boots, leaving the Stanleys to their tearful reunion. For Henry, the act of saving a child had required no second thought. It was simply the right thing to do. As Henry set Timmy down safely on the grass, Mr. Stanley approached him, his face a mixture of gratitude and shame. "Thank you," he mumbled, his voice thick with emotion. Henry, dripping wet and shivering, nodded, his usual calm demeanor unshaken. "I was just doing what anyone would do," he said quietly before walking away to collect his things. That night, Mr. Stanley replayed the incident in his mind, the image of Henry's bravery haunting him. For the first time, he reflected on his own behavior, realizing the weight of his earlier words. He felt a pang of guilt as he imagined the quiet strength it must have taken for Henry to endure such treatment daily. The following morning, Mr. Stanley knocked on Henry's modest home. When Henry opened the door, Stanley extended a hand. "I owe you an apology. For everything," he said, his voice sincere. "I was wrong to treat you the way I did, and I'm grateful for what you did for Timmy." Henry studied Stanley for a long moment before shaking his hand. "It's never too late to do the right thing," he replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. From that day on, Mr. Stanley became one of Henry's most vocal supporters, advocating for better working conditions for the janitors in their community. His transformation inspired others in the neighborhood to re-evaluate their attitudes, sparking conversations about respect and equity. For Henry, the incident was a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage could ripple outward, bringing about unexpected change.